his real father is. We look alike.
Even
We're having a family reunion.
We look more like brothers than them too.
It's frightening.
Put your glasses on.
I think it was the pool guy.
Separated at birth there. Good afternoon. We're going to go ahead and get this meeting started as a subcommittee, recognizing that there isn't a quorum. Today we're joined by Bill Berryhill, who will be replacing Sam Blakesley for today's hearing. With that, Mr. Perez, welcome. And as I mentioned, we'll be starting as a subcommittee, and as soon as we get a couple of members here to establish a quorum, we'll go ahead and take that. But with that, please present your bill, AB 1318.
Well, thank you. Good afternoon, Chairman Fuentes and members. AB 1318 seeks to administratively transfer emission reduction credits from the South Coast Air Quality Management District to a soon-to-be constructed new energy generation facility in my district. Thank you very much. My intention for introducing this legislation is not to undermine issues of environmental equity or to question and disagree with judicial decisions, but rather to advocate for a comprehensive remedy that will ensure environmental standing while also facilitating economic growth, job creation, and energy reliability. Though this legislation deals with one specific facility, I understand that there are other energy generating and public essential service facilities that are in the same situation as Sentinel. It is my hope that this vehicle can facilitate a constructive dialogue as to how a comprehensive remedy will address these questions. A comprehensive resolution that allows new energy generation facilities and public essential services to access valid emission reduction credits will help an ailing state economy and provide the necessary backup generation, helping the state to meet its renewable energy goals. For the local economy of the 8th Assembly District, the construction of Sentinel will create 350 union jobs.
Excuse me, Mr. Perez. We have a quorum. Seeing that, Madam Secretary, please establish a quorum and call the roll, please.
Fuentes.
Here.
Duval.
Here.
Tom Berryhill. Here. Bill Berryhill. Here. Buchanan. Carter. Here. Fong. Fuller. Here. Furutani. Huffman. Here. Krikorian. Skinner. Here. Smythe. Swanson. Tirico.
We're official. Continue, Mr. Perez.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. For the local economy of the 8th Assembly District, the construction of Sentinel will create 350 union jobs, a $50 million payroll, $2.6 million in new business taxes, $25 million in sales tax, and $6.4 million in annual property taxes. For a rural district like mine that has the highest unemployment rates in the country, and with local governments forced to lay off teachers and police officers to balance budgets, these new dollars go a long way to help alleviate a region being devastated by the current economic recession. Here with me to answer any technical questions is Bill Kissinger with CPV Sentinel, and I respectfully ask for your aye vote.
Thank you. Witnesses in support?
Thank you, Chairman Fuentes. Members of the committee, my name is Bill Kissinger. I'm here on behalf of CPV Sentinel, and I'd like to ask that you pass this bill out. You've previously had testimony on the priority reserve litigation, so I won't spend any significant time on that litigation, other than to say that the result of that litigation couldn't have come at a worse time for the state of California. The result of that litigation, which is between NRDC and a number of environmental groups against the South Coast Air Quality Management District, is that it's at this point impossible to issue air permits for any new power plants in the South Coast. I said it couldn't come at a worse time. That's because by the beginning of next year, more than half of the power plants in the South Coast will be more than 50 years old. And at the same time, we're trying to introduce into the mix of resources renewables that tend to be intermittent, that only generate when the wind is blowing, when the sun is shining. And without new generation has quick start capability, we will not be able to meet the goals and indeed the increasingly aggressive RPS goals that we have. Edison has been working hard to bring into its portfolio new generation, and to that end it's entered into a number of contracts which would allow the construction of new power plants in the South Coast. One of those power plants is the CPV Sentinel project, and that's on whose behalf I'm here today. AB 1318 is aimed at bringing only that power plant forward. It's a power plant which is 800 megawatts of new combined, new simple cycle peaking capacity. It uses LMS generation. It's located near Palm Springs, and it's in the Salton Sea Air Basin, a point that I'll come back to in a moment. It's exactly the kind of power plant that the state needs to add in the South Coast Basin. It's got quick start capability, so it can firm up intermittent resources like renewables. It is located within the Los Angeles Reliability Load Center, so that when it comes on, other older, less efficient power plants along the coast don't need to run. And in fact, ultimately, this power plant will displace the power plants along the coast that are old, inefficient, and need to be retired. This is a power plant that's good for ratepayers. It's a power plant that all the output has been contracted for from Southern California Edison. The contracts have already been before the Public Utilities Commission, which has concluded that the rates and terms under those contracts are just and reasonable. It's a power plant that's good for residents of Los Angeles and more generally the South Coast Air Basin, because the emissions from this power plant are not in the South Coast Air Basin, but actually in the Salton Sea Air Basin. It's a power plant because it's a peaker that only runs when it's needed. It's not like the old coastal plants that need to kind of run in low idle all night long in order to be available during the days when they're needed. And it's a power plant, unlike a lot of power plants, that's supported by its community. Last week, before the Natural Resources Committee, we had testimony from elected officials from Riverside County, the cities of Palm Springs, Desert Hot Springs, and Coachella, all of whom came in and said that they supported this project. And in fact, one of the speakers, one of the elected officials that came in, said that it's a rare thing when you get that many elected officials agreeing on one thing. And most importantly, this project is ready to go. If it weren't for the priority reserve litigation, it would be under construction today and would provide much needed jobs and investment on the lines that Assemblyman Perez just raised a moment ago. The problem is that this litigation stands in the way of that happening. And until there's a fix, it'll remain in limbo for some foreseeable time to come. Now, although this legislation has wide support from the community, it's viewed as an important future asset for Southern California Edison, there are opponents to it. And the thrust of the opposition to this legislation is that there's a view from certain groups that the credits that would be transferred under this legislation don't exist. There's been the argument made that the South Coast has simply conjured up these credits, that they don't actually exist, that there's somehow a violation of the Clean Air Act. Well, I'd like to say, and I'd say this advisedly, that's just nonsense. The credits that are in the internal banks, the credits that would be the subject, that would be transferred under this legislation, are the result of long negotiations between the U.S. EPA and the South Coast Air Quality Management District. They weren't just made up, they were the result of long negotiations. Nonetheless, you'll hear testimony today that suggests that they don't exist. What I would submit is that that's a subject in federal court. The expectation is that will get resolved in the next 60 to 90 days. And our view is, and I think the correct view, is the litigation that's been brought ultimately will not succeed. And in the end, there will be no doubt that EPA will find that the credits that the South Coast has in its internal banks, the credits that we're talking about transferring here, will in fact be viewed by EPA because they're the result of negotiations with EPA as being valid and fair. There are also plenty of credits in those internal banks. There has been a suggestion that there's not enough to go around and that somehow this puts the Sentinel project ahead of other projects. The fact of the matter is that if all three of the projects that Edison has under contract, not just the one that's at issue here, the CPV Sentinel project, but all three of them, were to go forward, in testimony given last week before the Energy Commission, the total quantity of credits that would be used from the internal accounts constitutes 14% of the total amount. So that leaves more than 85% of the credits available for essential services and small emitters.
Mr. Kissinger, the first, we're obviously talking about CPV, but the other two projects, which ones are those?
One is known as El Segundo. The other
Walnut Creek.
And Walnut Creek.
Okay, very good.
Exactly. Finally, there's been the suggestion that this legislation undercuts CEQA. And there again, I think that that is also incorrect. What this bill does is it leaves the litigation between the South Coast and NRDC intact. It doesn't change it. The litigation goes on. Right now, that decision from the Superior Court, which has at this point held up any new power plants from going forward, is on appeal. That appeal will continue. What this does is it provides for, what the legislation does is it provides for a means to transfer the credits so one of those projects can go forward, but not without the benefit of a CEQA review. The Energy Commission is not a patsy. No one would say that the review it does of projects is anything other than rigorous, and it will review the credits that come over to the commission, or excuse me, over to CPV. It will review those credits and make sure that they're bona fide and real. So whereas the original legislation as introduced included an outright transfer of the CEQA review to the CEC, the CEQA review now is left intact. It's not changed, but there will be a CEQA review of the credits when they go over to CPV as the Energy Commission reviews this project. So in the end, CEQA is not going to be undercut by this legislation. Let me call out one small quibble in the bill analysis that's worth pointing out. The legislation, there's a need for this legislation. If this legislation doesn't pass, there's the suggestion that this will resolve itself over time, that there will be a CEQA analysis done by the South Coast. It will examine whether or not there's an environmental impact of the rule, and it will ultimately come back to the Superior Court for review. In fact, though, the South Coast has decided not to do a CEQA review of the rule that's at issue, 1309.1. It is doing a CEQA review of the other rule that's at issue in the litigation, 1315. What that means at the end of the day is that the way that the credits are counted in the internal bank will be run through a CEQA analysis by the South Coast. But the portion of the rules from the South Coast that makes available the credits to electric generating facilities like CPV, that analysis will not be done. And at the end of the day, there won't be any resolution of this issue other than by way of the appeal that the South Coast is taking of the decision from last summer. The appeal is ongoing. It hasn't been briefed yet. It'll probably be another year before it's decided. So the no action alternative that's identified in the bill analysis correctly identifies a long period of time before this gets resolved. In fact, it'll be even longer than the bill analysis may suggest. A couple other points, and then I will stop. There was a suggestion at the hearings held last week that Los Angeles has some of the dirtiest air in the country, that building this power plant will somehow add to the burden that residents of Los Angeles confront. This is something of a red herring. In fact, it is a red herring argument, because this power plant is not located in the South Coast Air District, South Coast Air Basin. It's located in the Salton Sea Air Basin, and so its emissions do not impact people in the Los Angeles Air Basin at all. But the people of the Los Angeles Air Basin do benefit from it, because the result is that power plants located there get to be turned down. Another issue that's, and this is my last major point, and then I'll wind up, is that that this is not a global fix. This is a stopgap measure. And people have criticized this bill as saying that we need a global fix. And the truth is, no one would argue with that. We need a broader fix. We are facing a real crisis in California. The ISO has suggested that by the summer of 2011, we will fall, or we may fall, below critical minimum reserve levels. Now, whether that means blackouts or not, no one can say. That's a function of a lot of different things, function of whether we've had a good water year, whether or not we've got a rebounding economy, whether or not we've got a heat storm that goes on for days on end, whether we've got outages of old power plants. But the fact of the matter is, when you fall below those critical reserve levels, the ISO has to start making decisions about which power plant, which grids, which portions of the grid need to be turned off. And that's a risk we're running by not building new generation. Which comes to my conclusion. We need to do something. Ideally, we'd have a global fix, but we may not get there. AB 1318 provides a means by which to add some new generation, to do it quickly, and to take pressure off the system. pressure which is only building if we don't act quickly. Thank you very much. I'll be glad to take any questions.
Very good. Additional witnesses in support?
Oscar Abarca, representing the South Coast Air Quality Management District, in support of the bill. We also make a commitment to work with the author to find a comprehensive solution, and we're here to answer any questions you might have.
Delette Oldberg, representing Southern California Edison. Won't be redundant of the comments that Mr. Kissinger made, but we do have a critical need to integrate renewables. This type of project is critical to us making that integration successful. We have a power purchase agreement with this and the 3 other power plants. It is already behind schedule, and we fully support this bill. We also recognize there is a need for a larger fix and are supportive of that as well.
Members of the committee, Mr. Chair, Jeremy Smith on behalf of the California Labor Federation as well as the State Building and Construction Trades Council. Mr. Perez outlined clearly in the beginning of his comments how many jobs this means. This is a jobs bill for us, and we're here in support. Thank you.
Mr. Chair, committee members, Pat Zenzela here on behalf of GE Energy Financial Services, also here in support of the bill.
Mr. Chairman, members, Bob Reeb with Reeb Government Relations on behalf of the Desert Water Agency. You've heard about the air and the energy. Desert Water Agency has partnered with CPV to completely offset, more than offset, the groundwater impacts of this plant by transferring water on a permanent basis from the San Joaquin Valley down to this area. They've also partnered with CPV to expand the use of recycled water and thus save groundwater that's pumped now for a golf course down in Palm Springs. And further, CPV is going to work with the California Building Industry Association and the agency to purchase and install residential smart irrigation systems. So we're going to result probably in about 1,100 acre-foot of savings over the next 20 years from that. So there's a lot of good water quality and water supply impacts because of the project, and because of that, the agency supports the bill.
Great, thank you. Any additional witnesses in support? How about witnesses in opposition? Bill's been moved by Mr. Duvall. Looking for a second. Oh. Oh, very good.
Okay. Good afternoon. Assemblymember Fuentes, Chair, and members of the committee. I'm Jane Williams. I'm one of the plaintiffs to the lawsuit. As you know, I'm Executive Director of Environmental Justice Coalition in California, California Communities Against Toxics. And there's a number of issues that I just want to clarify with my comments. First of all, what's at issue here is the Federal Clean Air Act, not the State Clean Air Act, the Federal Clean Air Act. Under the Federal Clean Air Act, which was passed in 1990 and signed by then President Bush, there's a provision that is essentially a no net increase provision from pollution from stationary sources of air pollution. It's very similar to the port no net increase legislation that Senator Lowenthal has been working on for a number of years. Why was that legislation passed? It was passed because of public health issues. Very serious problems with morbidity and mortality from pollution from stationary sources. So it's important for us to keep in mind what the goals of the Clean Air Act were. The Clean Air Act is primarily a public health statute. The latest information from the California Air Resources Board indicates that 24,000 people per year are dying from particulate matter pollution in California. The majority of those deaths are occurring in Los Angeles. Again, I want to remind you that the National Ambient Air Quality Standards are health-based standards. They're not technology-based standards. Any exceedances mean that the health of real people is adversely affected. Whether you're in the Salton Sea Air Basin, whether you're in Imperial County, or whether you're in Los Angeles, all of those are in excess of the PM-NAAQS. In the case of the Salton Sea Basin, by many hundreds of times. This is not a minor problem. What this bill is doing is seeking to force the transfer of credits that are defined federally in the Federal Clean Air Act that are currently under litigation in the federal courts. Both in AB 32 and in the Federal Clean Air Act, there's a provision that says that these credits must be real. And the fact that these credits are being questioned to be real means that you could have a massive increase in air pollution. How large would that increase be if the credits are not real? It would exceed the emissions from the Port of Los Angeles. So what essentially is happening in this bill is that you have a group of investors for one power plant out of the 11 that were the subject of our litigation. We did not just bring this litigation to stop a power plant in Vernon. We brought this litigation to make sure that we did not have 14 tons of new particulate matter being emitted into air basins that are already putting people at risk. There's 11 plants, not one. This is a chart that I did for the first hearing. This shows the subsidy to the CPV plant right here. That's $115 million. The price of a credit now is $320,000 a pound. That's the last trade. The subsidy now would be in exceedance of $200 million. If this legislation were to pass, what this means is the investors of only CPV would get a windfall profit, essentially, of $200 million. That's what this legislation is about. It's not a global fix. It doesn't solve the problem of whether the credits are real. It does not solve any public health problems. It simply grants windfall profits to the investors of the CPV plant.
Good afternoon, Chair Fuentes and members of the committee. I apologize for my hoarseness. I'm coming down with something, but I'll do the best I can here. My name is David Pettit. I'm a lawyer with NRDC. We are a party, and we represented a number of parties in both the state court litigation that you've heard about and the federal court litigation that is ongoing, and we speak in opposition to the bill. I think that as we sit here this afternoon, I think that you folks sitting on the committee, you're being used, and you're being used by two different groups of people, both of which are in this for money. First off, you're being used by the investors in the Sentinel plant. These are people who knew about our CEQA lawsuit when they decided to invest in this project. They rolled the dice. You heard Mr. Kissinger say here today that our federal court lawsuit will not succeed. Well, that's what people thought about the state court lawsuit, and they were wrong. They invested money, and now they're asking you to be bailed out from having made a bad decision. Secondly, you're being used by the district, the South Coast Air Quality Management District. The rule that we attacked successfully in the lawsuit would have made for the district $420 million because the district's plan was to take these credits, which in our view they phonied up, and sell them, not just to the Sentinel plant, but to any plant that they wanted that would locate anywhere within the district's jurisdiction. We took, with our victory in the lawsuit, we took $425 million out of the district's pocket, and they're not happy about it. And what they have been doing is using the specter, the fantasy of an emergency, sewage running in the street, hospitals closing down, babies dying, to scare you into voting for something that will not help any of that in the least. The district wants to get back in the business of selling these scarce air permits to power plants, and they want you to help them do it under the theory that the gates of hell will open and hospitals will close and babies will die if you do not. And I have a very practical way where you can test that. There are roughly 1,500 permit applicants in the South Coast District who have asked for the very scarce air permits, which are now on hold as a result of the judge's ruling in our case. What this bill asks you to do is to put one facility, to jump the queue, to jump them to the front of the queue in front of all these other 1,500 applicants, every one of which will create jobs. Every one of those applicants will create jobs in the LA Basin. So, in fact, you're preferring one set of workers to another set of workers, and you know something? You don't need to do that, and here is a very easy fix for that. You can amend this bill very simply to say, before the Sentinel project gets credit number one. Every one of the 1,500 or whatever the number is, every one of the applicants who is now asking South Coast for credits for minor sources and for essential public services gets them. They get them before this project gets them. And I mean, we need to have a way to make sure that those credits meet the Clean Air Act, that they meet all of the standards, they're real, they're surplus, they're enforceable, and so forth. And we do that, and we put those credits out there and allow these public services that we hear about to go forward. You have representatives from the district from South Coast here in the room. Ask them. Call them up and ask them if that's okay with them. And I think they'll tell you no, because they don't want this problem to be fixed. They don't want the problem of essential public services to be fixed until they get back the right to make the $400 million that we took away from them. So that's a very simple thing that you could do. You could do this afternoon. We could do in working with the sponsor of the bill to really put this to the test. And let's use this, if we can, as a vehicle to get a whole lot more jobs up and running in the basin than would be the case if you just approved this particular bill. I want to address two other things very quickly. One is the argument that the lights are going to go out. If you look at the most recent CEC demand forecast for Southern California, the lights aren't going to go out. Demand is going down, not up, unfortunately because of the recession, but that's what's happening. It's not the case, it's just not the case that we need to build this plant tomorrow or the lights will go out in Southern California. Lastly, I do want to address the issue, as Ms. Williams pointed out, of the 10 additional fossil fuel plants that are in the queue for these credits. Every one of those plants, the proponents of every one of those plants, can come here and say, as these proponents have, our plant is critical, the lights will go out, our plant is going to create jobs. And what's to differ? What is to differentiate that argument for those plants from the argument we're hearing here? One of the things that really scares me about this is that if this is approved by the legislature, it's going to open the door to all of those 10 plants to come in and say, hey, what about us? You did a favor for these guys. How about jobs in my district? How about jobs in my area? We don't want the hospitals to go out, and we don't want babies to die in our area either. So in closing, I would urge you not to pass this bill out of committee, but if you do, let's put it to the test. Let's make sure that the mom and pops, the essential public services in the South Coast Basin, they get the credits they need before what I believe is an unnecessary, at least it's not necessary at this time, power plant gets its credits and its investors get bailed out. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. My name is Tina Andolino of the Planning and Conservation League. We oppose this measure. We feel that it is, in fact, an end run around CEQA and the judge's decision. While the individual power plants may undergo the CEQA process, the bottom line is this rulemaking needs to and should have undergone the CEQA process, and this bill is simply an end run around that decision. We urge your no vote. Thank you.
Anybody else in opposition? Any questions from members? Yes, Ms. Skinner.
You suggested some language for an amendment. With an amendment like that, what would be the process then for, how would that affect just the power plant that's at question? Not the others, the door opening that you're concerned about, but rather if it was amended to include the issuing of the permits to the essential public services, how would that affect the particular plant that Mr. Perez's bill is trying to address?
Well, I think there's two different questions in there. In terms of the opening the door argument, I think it would have no effect. I think that the other 10 plants could still come in and say, hey, what about us? You know, now you've taken care of these people in the basin, these mom and pops and the hospitals and the like, and you've taken care of the Sentinel project. Now, how about us? I think that argument would still be out there. So I'm not suggesting, or didn't mean to suggest, that the essential public services getting those credits out is a be-all and end-all and a total fix for the problem here. But I think as a matter of both calling the district to account and as a matter of job creation and, in my mind, of simple morality, we need to take care of those people before we take care of the investors in the Sentinel plant. And in terms of the what it would do for this plant, I think that there are plenty of credits in the account to do what I'm suggesting, and that is to fund all of the essential public services and to go ahead, and if it's the legislature's view, to fund this plant, setting aside the question, and it's a big question, of whether the credits are any good or not. But the idea, if I can just go on for 1 second, that I think I heard from Mr. Kissinger, that if you funded this plant, all the public services, and the 2 other plants that Edison wants, and that's only 14% of the credits, that's not right. That's pretty much all of the credits. And then when those are built, and the next person who wants to, open a hospital or, put a cleaner turbine in place of an older one comes to the district, there won't be any credits left, and we'll be right back here.
Okay. I was really just trying to get at the specific bill, and you had indicated a recommendation for an amendment that would be providing credits to the essential public services, and I wanted to know if there would be any contradictory or negating effect if that action were to be taken on the issuing of credits to the particular power plant that Assemblymember Perez what this bill is specifically trying to address. In other words, could the 2 be compatible?
Well, there are enough credits, if that is the question. If you add up the numbers that each need, there are enough credits that the district claims to exist in its credit bank to do both of those things.
There's another opinion to that.
Well, the problem is that the credits are being federally adjudicated. So you're talking about to fund the essential public services is well less than a ton. To fund the power plants is 14 tons.
All the power plants or this particular one?
All of the power plants. So the essential public services are just a very small problem. Remember, the litigation wasn't brought because you were generating counterfeit credits to give to Bob's Tortilleria, okay? It's because you're generating counterfeit credits to give to huge power plants that make millions and millions of dollars. Each one of these plants is like a $500 million investment, and over their lifetime, they will remunerate the investors with billions of collective dollars. A hospital is not a money-making operation. A fire station is not a money-making operation. That's why you've carved out these essential public services. They're essentially not-for-profit corporations. What you're doing here is you're essentially taking something that is supposed to be given for public service, like a school, and you're making money off of it. The district is making money off it, and I just pointed out the subsidy. This is the subsidy before it was $320,000 a pound. You're talking a subsidy now that's almost $1 billion to build new fossil fuel plants when you have absolutely no guarantee. In fact, I would say you have zero guarantee that old plants will be shut down. That has not been happening in California. New plants are built, old plants don't shut down. It is so incredibly profitable to make fossil fuel, whether you get a 40-year-old plant, a 20-year-old plant, or a brand new plant. You're talking about a lot of people making a lot of money. That's what this is about. It's about money, and what you're trading off here is public health.
I won't ask the question again. I appreciate that information, but I just wanted to see if I understand, independent of the other concerns, an amendment such as you suggested would not, as far as you understand, be in counter purposes to Assemblymember Perez's bill, which would be to also issue credits to the Sentinel Power Plant.
I don't think that it would.
And any additional questions, members? Very good. Seeing none, I apologize for missing some of the conversation here. I have a couple of things that I wanted to talk about very briefly. I think this is a very important issue. We raised this issue in the informational hearings that we had in terms of making sure that we're able to deal with the existing generation sources and figuring out how to update those, and you can't do that without these air credits. But we do have this little litigation that is something that has to be dealt with. I think first step or short-term fix here is going to be this bill, Mr. Perez, and I appreciate you bringing it forward, but it is only a first step, and I'm concerned about having a larger conversation that deals with some of the larger issues that are at hand in the litigation. So I'm happy to move this bill forward so we can deal with the larger structural fix. I'm not sure how we're going to do that at this point, but I did want to get on the record here and indicate that this is very important that we figure out a global solution. It seems that all the conversations been made. The bill was moved by Mr. Duvall. It was seconded by Mr. Tirico. Mr. Huffman.
Well, following up on your point, Mr. Chair, I want to thank you for raising the bigger picture here, because as it's currently framed, and even though I think Mr. Perez is doing a terrific job for an issue that's a district priority, and that's what his district would want him to do, there's just a much bigger set of issues at work here, and it does strike me as strange that at our level we would be picking out a single project instead of looking at the entire queue of 1,500 projects, including some pretty essential services that have been stuck as a result of this, and why we would say yes to this one project and no to 1,500 essential services projects in the queue. I don't feel comfortable with that. And so I'm grateful that, number one, the committee has flagged that in the analysis, and that you, I think if I'm hearing you correctly, are committing to working on a solution that's a little bit more thoughtful and comprehensive than a project-specific stab at a tough issue. And if that is indeed the case, I'm willing to support the bill moving forward. But I think I'm starting to get some clarity, at least speaking for myself, on what I'm going to want to see in this the next time I see the bill, because I think I'm done giving courtesy votes on this. What I want to see is the essential services part of the solution, the essential projects. I don't want to see these human shields anymore being used to inject hysteria into this issue so that we blow a gaping hole in CEQA and do other things, you know, as a lurching policy reaction. And the second thing is, if we're going to create this exception for a project that's out of the LA basin, I get that, because a lot of the EJ concerns we've heard about are really primarily LA basin oriented. But I think if we're going to do this, we ought to work towards some assurances that do address the problem in the LA basin as part of the solution. So, you know, I've talked to Mr. Perez and the project proponents. You know, what I would like to see, for example, is some kind of an assurance that these new policies of South Coast AQMD are not going to be used to grant more credits to power plants until there has been some kind of a thoughtful analysis along the lines of what we've heard about from some of the witnesses. If I can see all of that put together in a package, I'm happy to support this the next time it comes to me. But that's sort of the target that I'm shooting for. I'm happy to support the bill today, but I'm going to look for an awful lot more the next time I see this bill.
I think that's fair, and you know, there is a complementary, I shouldn't say complementary, a slightly different or a tremendously different bill moving in the Senate, and I think the goal here is that we need to figure out how to bring folks to the table for a resolution here. I don't think it's anybody's pleasure to do a one-off solution. It's certainly my preference to figure out how to do a three-off if we're going to do one, but I'd much rather see a global fix. And so I think I hear you loud and clear, Mr. Huffman, and hope that those conversations happen in short order. But you make some very valid points. Any additional questions or comments from Chairwoman Skinner? Natural Resources Committee had this as well. Madam Skinner?
We did, and it was a we made some amendments, one of which was to ensure that we weren't just writing roughshod off of CEQA, over CEQA, though, however, in effect, by moving the bill, we are intervening in a court case. And I think that I will say that it makes me very uncomfortable, because it is, I feel, not my place anyway to be the determiner that of the judge's adequacy or inadequacy of the ruling. However, I also know that the fact that the and this is no reflection on the bringers of the lawsuit, because I think it was quite appropriate that they brought the lawsuit, but by virtue of the pending decisions and that it has not yet reached a settlement, and that's not really due to anyone's purposefully trying to stop a settlement, but the fact that it hasn't has kind of created this in effect, stalemate in the entire basin in terms of the credits issue. So I feel similarly to Assemblymember Huffman that I will do a courtesy vote today, but I am not committing to supporting this bill in the future unless it deals with more than just the power plant fix, because I don't want to be putting the essential public services at a disadvantage and at an unlevel playing field because we intervened in just one portion. Express that.
I can well appreciate that. Representing Southern California in Los Angeles, there's a lot here that we want to figure out how to keep together, and I can appreciate that, Ms. Skinner. Seeing no other comments or questions, Madam Secretary, please call the roll.
Fuentes.
Aye.
Fuentes, aye. Duval.
Aye.
Duval, aye. Tom Berryhill. Tom Berryhill, aye. Bill Berryhill.
Aye.
Bill Berryhill, aye. Buchanan. Carter. Carter, aye. Fong. Fuller. Fuller, aye. Furutani. Huffman. Huffman, aye. Krikorian. Krikorian, aye. Skinner. Skinner, aye. Smythe. Smythe, aye. Swanson. Tirico. Tirico, aye.
Mr. Furutani just arrived.
Furutani. Furutani, aye.
Very good. We're going to go ahead and hold the roll open for another 5 minutes to make certain that the absent members have an opportunity to reflect their opinion on that vote. But that bill will get out. Yeah.
When I say it moved the bill, I mean shut up.
No, I know you had to get this one.
I knew on the
But see, we knew that too. I agree, guys.